Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on justice and advancement through HPSR, decolonization, chipping away at structures and processes. My name is Dr. Kamuya. I'm based at the Kemri Wellcome Trust Research Program in Kenya, and I'm excited to be one of the panelists and moderator for this webinar that brings together exciting topics on this area of decolonization. The webinar is hosted by the Ethics and Justice Thematic Working Group, which is one of the thematic working groups within the HSG, Health Systems Global. Just a minute. Within the Health Systems Global, we have also organized a session that will be held in the 7th symposium. Please, this webinar therefore builds into that organized session. The 7th symposium of the health systems will be held in Bogota, Colombia, from October 31st to November 4th. This will be a hybrid format of participation involving both in-person and virtual. Please visit the Health Systems Global website for registration. Registration is now open and there are early bird rates that are available. There's a detailed program also on the website. Please do visit. It will be a very exciting opportunity. There are different ways in which presentations, networking will be happening. The theme is health systems performance in the political agenda, sharing lessons for current and future global challenges. Before we switch to the webinar, which has got very exciting contributors and speakers, let me highlight a few housekeeping issues or areas. This webinar is recorded and will be shared on the Health Systems Global website. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself and to get involved in the discussions. In case you are facing any technical issue, please message the Health Systems Global team in the chat box. If you hover there, you'll see their names. You can just click on that and the question will go directly to the team and they can assist you. For questions and answers and comments, please remember to post them on the Q&A chat, the Q&A chat, not on the chat box. That way we can quickly pick those questions and we'll be able to respond to as many as we can. Remember to post your comments and questions throughout the session. We will share summary notes in English and Spanish after the webinar as a reminder in case of any technical challenges. This webinar is also being translated into Spanish. If you're Spanish speaking and you like to listen, please select the Spanish channel to hear the interpreter. And there are times that the presenter will be speaking in Spanish. Please do not change to the English channel. The interpreter will be in the Spanish channel only. If you want to listen in Spanish, click on the Spanish channel. If the presenter is speaking in Spanish and you want to hear the interpretation in English, please still click on the Spanish channel. Otherwise, select the original audio if you do not wish to hear the interpreter. Those are a few housekeeping. So as we know, decolonization has been and continues to be at the center of much discussion on many aspects, including global health research. Perhaps COVID-19 pandemic has amplified the need for frank, honest discussion and critical framing of decolonization. While theoretical and conceptual understanding of decolonization is critical, similarly are the transformative processes that should and must take place. Today in this webinar, we are excited to host a number of discussions and contributions that aim to understand justice and advancement through HPSR, decolonization, and looking at chipping away at structures and processes. We therefore have these two broad purposes for the webinar. One is to share ideas and actions that can be taken towards decolonization in HPSR and illustrate and discuss positive transformations within the field. The other is to consider how the risk of appropriation of decolonization can be mitigated within these activities. We have an exciting team of speakers and moderators, and I will introduce some of them. To cover these areas, we have organized our webinar in two major parts. The first part will have two speakers who will each speak for 10 minutes. And then we'll have an open session where we'll pick either questions from the comments chat or we'll give people opportunities to contribute or ask questions. I have Sasi and Nadia and others will be helping me with the question and answer session. Then we'll have the two speakers who will talk for another, each 10 minutes, a total of 20 minutes. And then we have two commenters, Shaya Abibola and Manasseh, who each will speak for 5 minutes. And finally, we have a final session of question and answer. So join me in enjoying this webinar, make it interactive. Please feel free to pose questions, make comments. It's for all of us. The webinar is, as I've said, hosted by the Ethics and Justice Thematic Working Group. And within that thematic working group, which some of us are members of, we consider ethical dimensions in health policy and systems research and promote a recognition that ethics issues and concerns are everybody's business. Please do visit our website and feel free to join if you are not already a member. We are co-hosting this webinar with two other networks. We are members, some of us are members of Decolonization and Global Health Research Exchange Network. This is a network that is funded by Wellcome Trust for 2 years, and it involves a series of interactions between academicians from health systems, feminist studies, and empirical ethics backgrounds. And we aim, and our work is largely around mapping, analyzing, and critically unpacking decolonization debates and global health research. And we are enriched by a large network of bodies, networks, organizations that are working in decolonization, including the International Institute for Global Health in the United Nations University in Malaysia, who have held a series of 3 dialogues co-convened with Wilton Park and Development Reimagined. And within these dialogues, the conversations have been about shifting power in global health. We have Professor David McCoy, who is one of the speakers in today, who is representing this network. They are planning to launch a new program in August on decolonizing global health in August 4th. Please do watch a space. It is now my pleasure and privilege to welcome the first 2 speakers, Dr. Cesar Atuere from Center for Tropical Medicine, University of Oxford and University of Ghana, who will be speaking on coloniality, uprooting and rooting a mangrove, and Professor David McCoy, International Institute for Global in the United Nations University, Malaysia, will be talking about colonialism and global health, mapping the terrain. Please welcome Dr. Cesar. If you are able to share your slides, could you do so?
Well, thank you very much, Dorcas. So while my slides are being put up, just for those watching us online, the name that you can see is Sasi Molino. I'm not Sasi Molino. I'm not that fortunate to be called Sasi Molino. You will get to see Sasi Molino later on. I am Cesar Atuere, and could we have the slides, please? Excellent. So I've chosen for this conversation the title of Coloniality and Rooting a Mangrove for a couple of reasons. Next slide. Anyway, what I'll be saying in these next few minutes is actually can be found in a paper that I co-wrote with Olivia Rutsazibwa, who's also a member of our decolonization network, on the stakes of decolonization and the COVID-19 pandemic. But what I'm going to try to do, next slide, is really to offer a sort of conceptual map, which will then set the ground for the speakers who will be coming after me. They will be tackling specific aspects and questions regarding decolonization, whereas I just want to point to some of the key concepts about decolonization, because themes that are this wide are often very difficult to pin down. And that is why I decided to choose the image of the mangrove. I come from Ghana. We have some mangrove forests just near the Atlantic Ocean. And while, I mean, it is absolutely important to conserve and preserve these mangroves, while I was moving through them once with a canoe, I asked myself, how can you uproot a mangrove? Mangroves are very interesting because on the one hand, up at the top, as you can see with this image, you see a very lush green, and underneath is a lot of mud, it's a lot of dirt, and it's very messy. And what's more, the roots tend to spread themselves in such a way that it's almost impossible to uproot one. And I thought to myself, well, decolonization is similar to trying to uproot a mangrove. So with this image in mind, let's move on to the next slide. So to talk about decolonization, I think the first thing we need to ask ourselves perhaps is, I mean, what exactly is wrong with colonialism? We just take it for granted that colonialism is wrong. And whenever we talk about this, what comes up to mind is the fact that, well, people were enslaved, natural resources were stolen, people were basically subjugated, and a lot of other things, pilfering, stealing, and all these things. Now, actually, come to think of it, you can't actually do these things without necessarily colonizing. So just equating these malpractices to colonialism does not arrive at the root of what is morally wrong about colonialism. And what is morally wrong, in my opinion, about colonialism is that the colonizers actually subtract the agency of a people towards self-determination. And not only did they subtract, they substitute it with another form of end. So the periphery begins to live for the purpose of the center. And therefore, territories are taken over, people are taken over, and their lives become a sort of agency that serves the interests of other people. And therefore, their own interests and their self-determining agency falls into second place, if not third place. And that is the moral evil of colonialism. But we can almost say, well, the colonial era is over, the 1960s, the winds of freedom, you know, the Union Jacks and the French tricolors going down all over the world, and new countries coming up. So the colonial era could be said to be over. But we're living in the post or post-colonial era, and what has actually taken over is what we now call coloniality, which is the legacy of the colonial era. Now, coloniality can be summed up in what Frantz Fanon wrote in, in his book. Gosh, I can't remember the title now. But anyway, it's, I mean, but what he did say was my freedom not given to me in order to build the world of the youth? Therefore, yes, to some extent, freedom was given to the peoples of the former colonized territories, but that freedom was given so that they will continue to build the model that was actually instituted by the colonial powers. And this is coloniality, and coloniality permeates the activities of the former colonized territories and also of the colonizers in the way they react, I mean, in the way they interact with the formerly colonized territories. Next slide. And Dorcas, do help me with the time so that I wouldn't go beyond the 10 minutes. So now, coloniality operates along three major lines. However, the interesting thing about coloniality is that it does not operate in an overt manner. It is almost silent, and it is difficult to actually see. You need to sort of like, lift the curtain to see how coloniality continues to operate and the colonial mechanism stays solid. And these three areas, and I'm just going to mention them briefly because I know the subsequent speakers will go into them more in detail. One is epistemicide. Epistemicide basically means the killing of knowledge from sources that are not considered to be sources that can actually generate knowledge. And this happens across fields. And especially when we're talking about health policy systems research, we talk about actually creating a normative system that does not allow other forms of knowledge to flourish. And I cite here a paper by Emily Clotter where she talks about the normative framework, for example, for approving traditional medicines. At the end of the day, it has been designed in such a way that for any form of traditional knowledge of medicine to be accepted and widely practiced, this form of medicine has to conform to the biomedical model. Therefore, if it does not conform to that model and those standards that have been set, then it is considered illegitimate or even sometimes fake. This way, we continue to ensure that certain forms of knowledge will never become official. And this is also entrenched in our educational systems. Secondly, we can talk about ecocide. And ecocide, yeah, sounds like, a terrible word, but the formerly colonized territories were actually designed to be producers of extractive material, primary products, natural resources like minerals, which are then processed and given value elsewhere. And therefore, they do not control the processes. However, from a health viewpoint, what we can actually see is that the extractive industries ensure and create conditions that people's life, people's health is actually put at risk. We can talk about mining. Just think of, the cobalt mining that is going on in the DRC Congo, or even gold mining in places like Ghana or in South Africa. These are activities that are designed in a way that actually has a negative impact on people's health and continue to, reduce people to poverty, whereas the goods that they are producing are actually goods that make many people or certain groups of people extremely rich. And the final line of operation of coloniality that I would like to mention is genocide. Now, when we think about genocide, we think about, killing of people directly in warfare, as it happened, in Rwanda, or it happened in the Balkans. But genocide has different levels. Genocide also can be a form of disabling of a people. And here, what tends to happen, especially in the area of health, is the case of saying that some lives actually do matter more than others. So, to give a recent example, we know that monkeypox has been around since the 1970s in parts of West Africa and Central Africa. But it never became an international emergency until people in Europe started contracting monkeypox. And when monkeypox appeared in Europe, it suddenly became an international emergency. Now, what about those people who've been living with this for years or for decades? And why was it not an emergency then? Now, this begins to show that there are some lives and some diseases that are not important because they only affect a certain type of people or a certain area of people. And these are the forms of genocide that are going on even within the global health sector. And it affects research as well because it affects our priorities. And our priorities are not determined necessarily by need, but by need of who. Anyway, let's move on to the next slide. So how do we tackle this? The broad ways, and I'm just going to mention two broad concepts. The broad concept is the de-imperialization concept. De-imperialization concept simply means that those groups and organizations that have always felt that they have the duty to save the world, and for that matter, solutions for the whole world need to come from them, perhaps need to revisit their framework. And this is where things like abolitionism come in. It is not a question of always sitting somewhere in the global north trying to find solutions for the global south. There are ways, and if we delegitimize, if we de-silence some of the knowledges that exist in those areas, perhaps we could be looking for solutions. And then the final concept, because I can see Dorcas is looking at me, that I mean, I'm running out of time. So I'll try to wind up with the final concept, which is pluriversality. And this we borrow from in decolonial discourse from the Zapatero movement in Mexico, where we talk about a world in which many worlds fit together. You see, one of the problems of colonization is a form of universalization. And uni here, I insist on the uni, which is there's only one way to look at things. But pluriversality means that actually it is possible to look at things from various angles. And let us remember this, and this is from Amartya Sen, and I'll conclude with this. You know, we do not necessarily have to agree conceptually on everything in order to be able to work together. All we need to do is to agree on the goals. But what is most important is for us to understand each other. We don't need to agree, but we need to understand each other. And that is how we can build a pluriversal world that allows various forms of knowledge to emerge and to be able to make a contribution to a richer and more complex world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sisa, for a very wonderful starting for the webinar. Please continue posting your questions on the Q&A, and we are welcoming Professor David McCoy for the next speaker.
Thanks, Dorcas. Can you hear me? Good. Okay, great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And special thanks to Dorcas and Sassy and others for organizing this webinar. I'm just going to jump straight in with my presentation by describing what I hope to cover, which is three things really. Let me see if I can move my slides. Yeah, I really want to focus the conversation on what I sometimes refer to as contemporary colonialism. I think over the past few years, when the decolonizing global health movement or rise in interest in this topic emerged, there's been, to my mind, quite a lot of focus on the power relations between actors and institutions in high-income countries as they relate to actors and institutions in low-income countries. The global north and the global south, countries that were former colonizers and countries that were once colonies. But I really want to bring a bit more attention to the new structures of colonialism, the new colonial relationships that have really emerged after the end of the Second World War, particularly from about 1980 onwards. And to make the point that I think the new colonial structures and relationships are relationships and structures that really transcend the nation state, and to a large extent also transcend racial differences. The old colonialism, of course, was heavily imbued by racism, because the colonizing countries and the colonies were clearly of different races. So that's one thing I want to draw attention to. And the second is to then say, if we are going to address contemporary colonialism, what should anti-colonial work look like today? And then finally, I want to end by discussing how the global health community relates to contemporary colonialism. I think nothing perhaps represents just how ruthless and how efficient contemporary colonialism is than some of the data presented here in this slide. 62 of the richest people own the same amount of wealth as 3.6 billion of the poorest people. The richest 20 billionaires are worth more than the entire GDP of sub-Saharan Africa. And on top of this, the global elite damage the planet and pollute the planet many-fold times more than the global poor. And the point about this slide is that the amount of extraction of wealth the extraction of resources from the planet is not necessarily done in a way that benefits populations, but really has become increasingly a form of appropriation, extraction that benefits individuals and elites, a tiny group of people across the world. And I think that's also another important point, is that the pattern of distribution of wealth and poverty is increasingly less aligned with the geographic location of upper income countries, middle income countries, and low income countries. We have billionaires in Africa, we have billionaires in Latin America, we have billionaires in Asia, and we have increasing numbers of people living in poverty in high income countries and middle income countries. In fact, the biggest number of people living on less than $2 a day currently reside in middle income countries. So I think the pattern of wealth and poverty distribution is something that we need to look at, and to some extent de-link from the way in which we tend to kind of look at hierarchies in terms of nation states and to some degree in terms of race as well. There's also a temporal dimension to contemporary colonization. If we think about the destruction of the planet, the misappropriation of natural wealth by the current generation, perhaps the past 2 or 3 generations, and how this really represents a form of theft from future generations. This too perhaps is something that we should incorporate into our discussions about contemporary colonialism. If indeed colonialism is partly about the appropriation of resources and wealth, the taking of certain things from others. So it's not to say that the vestiges of the old colonialism are irrelevant. Of course, much of the power structures that we see today are rooted in the colonialism of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and they continue to reinforce power asymmetries and imbalances. And we must address that, and we must continue to address the contribution that racism makes to these inequalities in power and wealth. But to be anti-colonial today, I think we need to be looking beyond that. We need to be looking at, for example, the role played by private actors in the global economic space, and in particular, the role played by transnational corporations and private finance capital, which are really the engines for this unconscionable degree of wealth and power asymmetry that we saw earlier with those Oxfam statistics. I think it also means being globalist and internationalist. To be anti-colonial today really does require to build social solidarities across national boundaries. It requires us to think about creating solidarities across racial divides, cultural divides, religious divides. Much of contemporary colonialism is really a form of extraction by an elite from, to a large extent, almost the rest of humanity, when you consider the extreme amounts of concentration of wealth and power in this tiny elite. And this is important because this tiny elite may be small in number, but their impact is incredible when you consider what impact they have on the way that democracy operates, the manner in which they're able to control the media, the manner in which they're able to undermine science, and the manner in which they, to some degree, are able to maintain privilege and power by creating social divides, by creating conflict. At the same time as thinking about the deficits in this current system of globalization, the neoliberal global economic system that has allowed wealth to be accumulated and appropriated in this manner, we continue to need to operate at the national level by holding governments accountable. It is only governments that can break up the monopolies that enable this wealth extraction to continue. It's only governments that can fix the problems of illicit financial flows, tax evasion, tax avoidance. That also is a major mechanism by which wealth and power is accumulated by so few. And in the same way that in the past, colonialism was justified and legitimized by ideas, such as the ideas that certain races were inferior to others, we can also see ideas today helping to sustain this current system of colonialism. And we need to challenge these ideas. These include ideas such as those that suggest that free markets, unregulated free markets and competition is the best way to proceed with human progress, or the idea that only economic growth can properly address poverty. So there are a whole range of myths and assumptions and ideas that help to kind of sustain this system that enables so much wealth and power to be accumulated in such few hands. So if that's the kind of world that we live in today, how does this relate to global health? How do we, thanks Dorcas, what does this all mean for the global health community itself? So here, I think in moving forward at the United Nations University, we're hoping to launch a program of work where we're wanting to look at 3 different dimensions of colonialism and global health. The first is to look at colonialism and coloniality within the global health community itself. So this is going back to those issues of the relationships between actors and institutions in powerful countries and those in less well-resourced countries. Secondly, we want to look also at the colonization of the global health system itself. Who dominates the global health system? Who dominates the global health structures, the global health narratives? Who shapes the policies and the priorities that are set within the global health community? And who has colonized this space? So that is another dimension of colonialism as it relates to global health. And then the third is finally to look at the way in which the global health system interacts with the wider political economy. And here, of course, I think the point is that the global health system itself is part of the wider global political economy. It is a market, it is a space where people are also able to extract wealth and advantage. And COVID has really demonstrated the ability for the global health system itself to contribute to this wider system of political and economic inequity. The way in which we responded to COVID has aggravated global inequalities, and the manner in which we govern the pharmaceutical sector has clearly been demonstrated through this COVID pandemic to be as much a part of the problem as it was a part of the solution. So I'm going to end there and look forward to some comments and questions about how you think the global health community should respond both to the older forms of colonialism as well as the contemporary forms of colonialism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for again another very exciting presentation on this topic. Please do remember to post questions. This is now open for anyone who might have a question. I can pick 2 questions that have been posted. One is by an anonymous person who acknowledges that colonialism was morally wrong. How should we go about addressing colonial legacies that are currently useful? For example, systems or processes of governance that are useful to the formerly colonized. Any takes, either Cesar or David? Are you able to respond to the question?
Dorcas, sorry.
Go ahead, David.
You cut out and I didn't quite hear it, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry, I can repeat. And Cesar, are you able to hear as well?
Yes, you can. Sorry.
Okay.
A bit tricky with two of us here.
Okay. Acknowledging that colonialism was morally wrong, how should we go about addressing some of the colonial legacies that are currently useful? And they give the example of some of the systems or processes of governance that are useful to the formerly colonized nations and states.
I mean, I'll respond to that a little bit, Dorcas, very quickly. I think globalization is a really important factor in all of this. The impacts of globalization in terms of hollowing out the state in many low-income country settings, removing economic sovereignty from governments in many respects, and it's going to be really important, I think, for the development of these solidarities across national borders to be able to fix all these various problems at the global level or the supranational level. So it's not going to be enough, in my mind, to simply act at the national level. We're going to have to do both, acting at the national and global and international level.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to what David has just said, and also answer the question with regard to the useful colonial legacies. When we talk about decolonization, I think it is important to keep in mind something. It is not about going back to undo what has been done, because that is virtually impossible. And even when we talk about, cultures and identities, strictly speaking, there is no pure culture. Cultures and identities continually evolve, they blend, and people change with time. The difficulty or the problem is when this form of encounter between peoples and between cultures silences almost, or even sometimes violently, certain voices. So when we talk about, returning to some of the legacies that have been useful, yes, and for example, we have, healthcare systems, we have educational systems in the former colonies. It's not about basically throwing all that away, but it is about saying, well, let's go back into these systems and see, how do these systems silence certain people or certain knowledge or knowledge and values, and how can we bring these back and integrate them into it? So it is not a sort of retreat into the past, but it is a question of enriching the present to really represent who we are. Because actually what is happening if you live in the former colonies is that in the former colonies, we tend to have the two states. This discourse has been going on for over 40 years in Africa. So we have the official state, which follows the colonial model. And then we have the citizens who live according to different values and different standards. And sometimes that actually creates not only inefficiency, but dysfunctionalities in the way governments and systems are supposed to run. Then
Cesar, can I respond to Cesar and say that if colonialism is about domination and subjugation, if it's about exploitation and appropriation, are there any colonial legacies that are useful? I don't see the sharing of information, the sharing of knowledge, the exchange of culture as being colonial. And that did happen during the colonial era, but I don't define that as being, what is essentially colonial or part of colonialism. I think colonialism has really got to be defined in terms of that domination and subjugation of others, and about appropriation, exploitation, and extraction.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page, because what I'm trying to say is that yes, during the colonial era, there was also an encounter of peoples, and these encounters would have actually taken place without colonialism.
Yeah.
Because as people develop and move out of territories, people intermingle. But what colonialism was to take this form of intermingling and encounter of peoples and transform it into an agenda of subjugation and alienation. And these are the things that we need to some extent to correct, not to some extent, we need to correct today. Then there was the question about the appropriation. I think was, I don't know whether that question has been addressed already, or should I, Dorcas?
Perhaps in the next 1 minute.
1 minute. Well, that's kind of difficult. Well, in the first place, let me say something. With these discourses like decolonization, they don't belong to anybody. They belong to all of us. The former colonized need some form of decolonization, and the colonizers need to decolonize. It's just that it puts in, the demands are different depending on which divide you are. So the era of the appropriation is the former colonized sort of like taking up this whole discourse again and then pushing the decolonization on the formerly colonized. And that is where it becomes wrong. So it becomes just a question of inclusions and sort of like tokenistic actions. No, it is about sometimes, and we talk about this often in the decolonization network, it's about stopping to do what you have always been doing. And that's what abolitionism is about. So there is a pandemic. Do we meet in London and decide how to run the world, or in Geneva, how to run the world in this pandemic? Or are we going to really listen to other voices? And these are the things that we're talking about.
Thank you very much, David and Sisa. This is going to continue. Please continue posting the questions. The next set of speakers, we have 2 presenters. Are you ready, Bridget?
Yes, I am.
As you're loading the presentation, I can introduce you.
Yeah.
Bridget is based at the Australian Catholic University in Australia, Professor Bridget Pratt, and she's going to be speaking about confronting the crisis in knowledge production for global health, applying a social justice lens. And then we'll have Ms. Benilda Badzin. She's the Executive Director of Center for the Study of Equity and Governance in Health Systems in Guatemala. And Ms. Badzin is going to be talking about how rural indigenous communities in Guatemala are decolonizing health policy and systems research. At the point that we will call Ms. Benilda to present, we'll ask you if you to use the English, the Spanish channel, if you want to listen to the translation in English. I will again send a reminder at the point. Welcome, Professor Pratt.
Thanks, Dorcas. So today I'm going to be providing a social justice lens to the question around how do we decolonize global health research. And so the first point that I want to make is that there's a crisis in knowledge production for global health, and this includes health policy and systems research. And in saying that, this isn't a new crisis. This has been going on for quite some time, and it's reflected in massive asymmetries around power and privilege within the field. It's also reflected in a lot of the epistemic injustices and wrongs that are inherent within global health research. And so it's clear that a transformation is needed if we're going to decolonize the field and also to make the field better able to achieve its underlying goals around equity and promoting social justice. And so this raises the very important question, what should the transformation look like? Where do we want to go from here? And I think the ethics field has a key supporting role to play in that ethics deals in the normative. So what ideally we would like to see happen. And the ethics field actually develops guidance around how global health research can be organized or structured in order to generate new knowledge that will help reduce inequities and social injustices. So the field has been doing this for a while. I'm just putting on the screen 2 recent examples that have just come out in the last year or 2, but there is a body of work that predates that, going back, I don't know, about 10 or 20 years. And a lot of the work that I've been doing over the course of my career has been developing this type of ethics guidance around how do we link global health research and health systems research to greater equity and social justice. And over the past couple of years, my approach has been kind of a 2-pronged process. So the first step has been trying to develop what I've ended up calling a multi-dimensional social justice lens. And this is really just about integrating understandings of social justice from both the global north and the global south. Over the past few years, I've become increasingly aware that the ethics field has primarily, and myself included, have primarily relied on understandings of social justice from the global north in our work. And so I've been trying to develop this lens to better integrate theories of social justice and decolonial theory from the global south, so that our understanding of social justice isn't quite so epistemically unjust. And then the second part has been to apply that social justice lens to the global health research context. And that means that each dimension of the lens, I've tried to identify ethical responsibilities for the field of global health research. And so these responsibilities apply to researchers, funders, journals, educators, the whole range of actors involved in global health research. And so in whatever short amount of time I have left, I'm going to quickly introduce the multidimensional lens, and then I'm going to talk about hopefully 2 of its dimensions before I get cut off. So I'll define them and then identify what ethical responsibilities are linked to the 2 dimensions. And then I'll also propose a couple of possible strategies for how different global health actors might try to achieve some of the responsibilities that I've identified. And those strategies are not an exhaustive list, so they're just some possible examples. So the multi-dimensional lens has 5 different dimensions: well-being, recognition, power, inclusion, and harmony. And each dimension reflects a different understanding of social justice and what it's trying to achieve. And at least from the theory that I have read, which I will say is, not everything that's out there, but the theory from the global north and global south that I've read, it seems like the well-being and inclusion dimensions are very much emphasized in theories from the global north, and then a little bit of the recognition and power dimensions. And then in theories from the global south, you get harmony and a much stronger emphasis on recognition and power. And so if we just look at the power lens. So power is about reducing unfair power relations that create an unequal playing field where some people have to work really hard to achieve decent health and well-being, and other people, it's not something they have to work very much to do. And so there are a couple of different power relations that are important, I think, to global health research. Subordination, which refers to where a small number of people have control and get to make the decisions that apply to a much wider group of people. And you can see subordination reflected in unfair divisions of labor. Exploitation, where more powerful actors take advantage of other people's vulnerability to ensure that they benefit more than the people that they're exploiting. And then coloniality, which essentially refers to unfair power relations that arose during the colonial period. So that encompasses exploitation and subordination where they're involved between the global north and the global south. And so when we're thinking about global health research and what unfair power relations are present there, coloniality immediately has to come to mind. We see subordination in unfair divisions of labor where researchers from the global south are often relegated to data collectors in their roles. We see exploitation in the unfair levels of benefits in terms of who's benefiting from the interventions being developed and the career opportunities in the field of global health research. And so the unfair power dynamic lens grounds a responsibility for the field to first build awareness that relations of subordination and exploitation and other unfair power relations exist between the global north and the global south in global health research. And then it also grounds a responsibility to actively decrease those unfair power relations by shifting both control and benefits to the global south, and also by reducing unfair divisions of labor. And so in terms of some strategies, one thing for researchers that's really important is to start having more conversations, more reflexive conversations about power dynamics as part of your collaborative work. So really having discussions within your research team at the start and throughout a project around what power dynamics are at play and how those can be navigated. Another strategy involves thinking about who's in the driver's seat during grant writing, and is it an equal number of researchers from the global north and the global south, or is it even possible to have higher numbers of researchers from the global south in the driver's seat? And that is another strategy that would apply to funders when they're designing their grant programs. Just because the funder is in the global north, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't have equal, if not more, staff members from the global south who are in the driver's seat for designing the grant programs that are for global health research. And Dorcas, should I stop there, or do I have enough time for another dimension?
You just have half a minute, what you can cover within that.
Okay, so recognition is about respect for different cultures and epistemologies and ways of knowing, and also about making them visible. So it's trying to avoid, disparaging different cultures and ways of knowing, and also erasing them. So this really grounds a responsibility for the field of global health research to incorporate and use epistemologies, theories, concepts, methods, and data from the global south in the field, because at the moment they're largely missing. And so some strategies there are to collaborate with researchers who are epistemically located in the global south. So that doesn't just mean they're based in the global south, it means that they're actually trained in the knowledge systems from the global south. It also means that our education programs in global health actually teach different epistemologies and methods from the global south. And for funders, it means that they need to interrogate how epistemically fair their funding processes are. And I've just put up an article that's come out recently that has a lot to say about that particular topic and is very interesting. And my last slide is just to say that social justice is one way forward, not the only way. And it's within our power to design studies, education programs, and grant programs better than we currently are. And the question I'm going to throw out potentially for the Q&A is just, one option is to say, you know, transformations are more incremental, so we should be aiming to do better from project to project, from funding cycle to funding cycle. But is that the approach we want to take here? Are we happy with the transformation being incremental, or do we want things to change faster, and for certain actors like funders to make bigger changes faster? So I'll hand over to Vanilda now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Another very exciting discussion and providing also very practical ways in which we can do transformation. I now welcome Ms. Benilda. As I said, she'll be speaking in Spanish. So if you want to hear in English, please click at the interpretation and click Spanish channel, because the interpreter is in the Spanish channel and will be interpreting from that channel. Thank you. Welcome.
Muy buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Es un gusto para mí poder estar presentando cómo nosotras las comunidades locales en Guatemala estamos participando. Quisiera abordar 3 puntos. El primero son las expresiones de colonización. En Guatemala, y es de su conocimiento, en América Latina, las comunidades hemos estado luchando contra la colonización de 5 siglos. La ayuda al desarrollo, incluida, son áreas que se asemejan a la estructura de larga data de la colonización. En nuestra visión como comunidades indígenas, la colonización en la salud y la HPSR se expresa cuando los actores occidentales, incluidas las autoridades nacionales indígenas, ignoran nuestras prácticas y conocimientos tradicionales en salud. En Guatemala, grupos étnicos que tenemos nuestra forma de organizarnos, pero también tenemos nuestras medicinas ancestrales. Cuando prestan servicios a las comunidades, las decisiones las toman de arriba hacia abajo. En la mayoría de los casos, los servicios en la mayoría de las comunidades indígenas se prestan sin ninguna oportunidad de preguntarse por qué las comunidades indígenas enfrentan peores resultados de acceso a salud. Entonces, ¿por qué descolonizar? En nuestra experiencia como SEIS y en nuestro trabajo, la salud y los derechos de salud son un punto de entrada importante para empoderar a las comunidades indígenas para abordar la exclusión. Disculpen, tuve un problema técnico. ¿Ven la pantalla?
Hi, Benilda.
Yes, I can.
Sí.
Can I request you to switch to the English channel?
Okay.
at the bottom between Q&A and apps.
No me aparece, solo aparece español.
If you click on interpretation and then switch to English.
I think she might be having a bit of problem seeing the panel down, the selection down, because when she's presenting, it covers that section.
Yes, then perhaps continue.
Va.
Yes, let's just continue. That's fine.
Sí, ahorita. Yo creo que ya. ¿Ya me escuchan?
Now it is clear. Yes, now we can hear you well.
Ahora yo ya me escucho. Si me pudieras escribir, Fernando, por favor. Ahora, de acuerdo. Gracias. Entonces voy a la siguiente pregunta. ¿Por qué descolonizar? En nuestro trabajo, como les comentaba, la salud y los derechos a la salud son un punto importante para empoderar a las comunidades y abordar la exclusión histórica y el racismo que hemos sufrido. También trabajamos con activistas indígenas de todos los campos. La justificación de nuestro trabajo es la siguiente. Si su lucha como pueblos indígenas en el acceso a tierra, la equidad de género, la agricultura sostenible, entre otros, usted y su familia deben estar sanos para poder luchar. Por lo tanto, la salud, los sistemas de salud y la atención médica son recursos y resultados importantes para las comunidades indígenas. Las comunidades indígenas no deben seguir siendo beneficiarias pasivas de los servicios de salud. Deben convertirse en ciudadanos activos que exigen responsabilidades y derechos. Entonces, ¿cómo lo estamos haciendo? ¿Cómo estamos descolonizando? Nuestra investigación, acción y procesos para construir la capacidad de las comunidades se basa principalmente en las prácticas indígenas de solidaridad y liderazgo con el ejemplo. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Solidaridad, acompañamiento, empatía y poner a la persona en el centro. También apoyar en el proceso de formación y asistencia continua a la red de defensores y defensoras comunitarias por el derecho a la salud, porque en Guatemala tenemos alrededor de 200 activistas entre hombres y mujeres en 35 comunidades del país. Un punto importante que es predicar con el ejemplo. Demostrar que uno tiene el conocimiento y las habilidades que también, que eso implica que yo he realizado, he llevado a cabo esas acciones en el pasado. Yo no puedo capacitar a la gente en una defensa activa pro equidad, pro inclusión, si yo no lo he hecho primero. El conocimiento teórico es muy importante, pero no es suficiente. Debemos de demostrar conocimiento con experiencia. El conocimiento experiencial combinado con la solidaridad permite credibilidad y confianza. Lo anterior dicho es lo contrario de lo que sucede en el campo de la salud global, incluido la investigación en sistemas y políticas. En nuestros países del sur, estamos constantemente recibiendo expertos que no han llevado a la práctica los conocimientos. Para nosotros como comunidades indígenas, esa práctica carece de credibilidad. Nuestro enfoque como centro de estudios es principalmente intersectar el empoderamiento de las comunidades en temas de derechos humanos, auditoría social, empoderamiento legal y sobre todo la responsabilidad social. Como ustedes pueden ver en las imágenes, nosotros como SEGS implementamos procesos formativos en donde son formados las 200 personas que son una red de defensores y defensoras comunitarios en los temas de vigilancia ciudadana, auditoría social, derechos humanos, políticas públicas, porque la mayoría de las comunidades desconocen que la salud es un derecho humano importante, pero que sobre todo su participación social también es un derecho y que eso es muy importante para que se den los cambios. Cuando las comunidades ya han recibido el proceso formativo, iniciamos un proceso de auditoría social en los servicios de salud para identificar problemas, necesidades, tanto con los usuarios que acuden a los servicios como también con el personal de salud. Esto con el objetivo de iniciar procesos de diálogo, incidencia, con la participación activa de los defensores, de las ciudadanas y ciudadanos y hacer voz para que realmente las acciones sean con pertinencia cultural. Ustedes pueden también, junto con las comunidades, nosotros hemos producido conocimientos. Esto se difunde a través, si ustedes pueden ingresar a la página de segs.org.gt, tenemos publicaciones, tenemos videos de los mismos defensores expresando sus conocimientos, sus experiencias. Hoy en día hay suficientes profesionales indígenas, como lo es mi caso y el de mis colegas del SEGS, que pueden liderar el trabajo junto con las comunidades. Necesitamos la solidaridad, el apoyo y la alianza de académicos e investigadores que quieran trabajar verdaderamente para descolonizar tanto la ayuda al desarrollo como la HPSR. Muchísimas gracias.
You're muted, Dorcas.
Okay, now I'm muted. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, Thank you, Benilda. Again, very transformative piece of work that you're sharing on how local communities can be very much engaged and transforming what knowledge is taken up, addressing issues of epistemic knowledge issues. Thank you very much. We have some questions. Please check on the Q&A. Some questions have been responded. Continue posting. What you're going to do next, we'll have two commentators. We have Sheye and Manasseh, who each will take a few minutes to either give their inputs, respond to some of the questions, or raise other issues that we need to take account of. Can I start with who among you is ready to go first?
Sheye.
Okay, Sheye, go ahead.
Yeah, it's been great listening to the talks and also observing the questions and the answers. One of the things that I noticed in the questions, but that I've also noticed more broadly in discussions around decolonization and global health, or coloniality and global health, is that there's a tendency for us to keep preaching to the converted. That a lot of us having these conversations have been having these conversations and are fully convinced, are fully persuaded, and we're willing to run with it. But I've noticed that there are people who are less enthusiastic, but also much less vocal. So you don't even get to know who is not enthusiastic or who has concerns about the discussions and the debates. And some of the questions already suggest that there are people who do have concerns, for example, around the potential for the discussion to cause quote unquote harm. And I think it's important for us to know how to listen to those people and to also know how to respond, provide clear-headed and compelling response. And there's a series of such categories of complaints or questions that the social scientist Albert Hirschman framed in one of his books titled The Rhetoric of Reaction. So he had these three sets of things that people who have concerns about progressive campaigns, the kinds of arguments that are often made and the kinds of complaints that are often leveled at those campaigns. So I'm going to run through each of them without spending too much time, but to give us a sense of a way of framing our approach to those questions and those concerns. So the first one, Hirschman called futility. So this idea that this is such a big problem that there's no way of solving it. So why are you guys just hitting your heads against the wall? There's that category of responses, which also then means that those who believe that are not keen to engage because you guys are just wasting your time. There's another category of people, or category of responses, more correctly, that sort of that Hirschman called jeopardy, which is the idea that these responses, or rather these debates and discussions, are going to endanger previous gains in global health, for example. And one of the questions in the chat box pointed to that is there a risk that researchers from high-income countries will stop working on problems or issues in low and middle-income countries? So there's a category of complaints that speak to jeopardy, that it will destroy something that we already have, which is good. The third category, which is perversity, Hirschman called it perversity, which in its framing, it's the kind of argument or concern that a progressive cause, such as decolonization in global health, will even worsen that which it set out to solve or to improve. Right? So not previous gains as in jeopardy, not that it is futile as in you can't even achieve your goal, but that even that thing you set out to do will become worse because you're doing it. And for me, I think about these three lines of responses, and I'm always retooling and reworking in my mind how to make sure that I have clear-headed responses to each of them whenever they come. And I think it's important that we in this community take those seriously and take that kind of framing on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheye. Manasseh.
Yeah, thanks. And greetings, everybody. I have a couple of points, and Both are related to challenges, and they fit in quite well to the second point and the third point made by Shay with regards to endangering previous gains and perversity. Now, when we talk about decolonization, we are, as a group in the literature, it's about advancing justice. Now, the history of colonialism is such that in the colonies, whatever may be the colonial power, France, Spain, Britain, whatever may be the colonial power, but colonies, social groups in colonies, some social groups have also benefited from the social colonialism process, in the sense that members of certain social groups in erstwhile colonies, which are post-colonial societies, have benefited from modern education, international language, familiarity, education in international languages such as English, Spanish, French, and of course, sociocultural processes that colonialism set in motion. Now, when we talk about decolonialization, what happens is we need to engage with the elites in post-colonial societies who continue to benefit and dominate HPSR. And beyond HPSR also, they are very well-entrenched elites in the post-colonial societies, in the former colonies. So we need to very actively, consciously engage with these elites, because members of these elites dominate not only the post-colonial societies, but also beyond post-colonial societies in the international fora. So that was the first point I wanted to make, and which fed in well with endangering previous gains that Shay made. So this is also about talking to people in the global South who have had a different experience of colonialism. Yes, there has been extraction, but there are also, we should recognize, and academic literature tells us so, that there have been groups who have benefited in the colonialism process. My second point, which is with regards to the very real danger of the appropriation of decolonization. It is a very progressive idea. When we talk tonight, it's evening here in India, but yes, when we talk today, we are talking to advance justice, which is inherently progressive in its spirit, in its letter. But there is a very real danger that we are seeing globally, that decolonization may appeal equally strongly to forces who need not or may not believe in social justice. They may have a fanciful idea of going back to a mythical golden era, and that's happening across countries of the world. It may be pre-colonialism, but those societies do have injustices in those as well. So colonialism, decolonization, as in the spirit of advancing justice, may actually get appropriated in a very perverse way by forces which are inimical to the cause of social justice. These are the couple of points I wanted to make. Thank you so much, Dorcas.
Thank you, Manasseh, and Shaya for very good comments and linking the different speakers and the questions that have been posted. We have around 10 more minutes. We have a wrap up that will take 3 minutes. So we have 7 minutes in which to respond to some of the questions that have been posted. I've seen some of them have been responded. If I could just pick one of the questions and ask one of the panelists to respond. There's a question about youth. And my question has disappeared. So Sasi, if you can pick that question, please can you raise it? Youth are the leaders of tomorrow, yet they are being educated with models based on and propagate the colonial past. What would be your suggestion on empowering the agency of the youth? any of the speakers, please feel free to respond to that question.
Well, can I come in?
Yes, please, Peter.
Okay. This is about taking a new look at our educational systems. If you remember the debates that happened a couple of years ago around the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, starting at the University of Cape Town. And what the students there were talking about was actually the idea of revisiting the curriculum to ensure that more voices and experiences are included in the learning process. Now, this is something that needs to take place not only in countries like South Africa, where you have, which is a former colonized country, but it also needs to take place in the former colonized countries. The curriculum of students in the United States, in the UK, I remember giving a talk at the Blavatnik School where I was talking about, in philosophy, students that I was teaching in Ghana knew more about British and American philosophers than the best students in British and American universities know about African philosophers. So that same thing, this means that in revisiting our educational curriculum, we need to ensure that young people on both sides are actually offered the possibility to know more about the experiences of people outside their particular domain. And therefore, we should not only be teaching a one-sided curriculum. And this requires a lot of work, but that is one example of what we can be doing.
Thank you, thank you. And I'm sure there are others that would also provide other suggestions of how we can address that. And because of time, I'll just pick one, which was about acting across levels, means paying attention to who acts and how they act, and making this acting the job of those bearing the burden of colonialism. Where do they feature in that? And this was also sent anonymously. Anyone who would take that? Perhaps, if not, I can. Yes, David.
Sorry.
Did I see David coming in?
Okay, sorry, Dorcas, I missed it.
Yes.
Did you address this to me?
Acting across levels requires thought about who acts and how to act. How to avoid making this acting across levels the job of those who bearing the burden of colonialism. I think there's something there that is missing, but how do we make it that it is not just a burden of those who are bearing the burden of colonialism, but rather they understand it's more holistic. I did see some of the suggestions from Bridget's work in how she was talking about engagement and social justice, in Benilda's work when she was talking about how we can ensure that communities and stakeholders contribute meaningfully to what is being put on the table and to also the agenda of what global health needs to be addressing at the community level. But I wondered whether beyond those suggestions, there would be other suggestions from across the panelists.
Dorcas, can I just say that I think it helps if we really understand colonialism and contemporary colonialism as something that is universal and global. It is something affecting populations in all countries, depending on where you are in the social strata. And understanding that, I think, is a really important part of what I was trying to say in terms of building solidarities across national identities, across racial identities, and across religious identities. This system of exploitation is to a large extent unconcerned about your race, your religion, or your skin color. It's really a system of wealth accumulation that cuts across these kind of social identities. And where social identities are drawn in, it's often, with the intention of actually creating divides and conflicts that enable the system to continue to perpetuate itself. Just as in the past, colonialism built itself on divide and rule tactics. We see that today in contemporary colonialism.
Thank you very much. And we have a few minutes for one more question. Anyone who wants to, one of the panelists, any question, or any one of the contributors, any question you might want to respond to? Yes, Sheye.
Can I, Helen Schneider, I think made a very important point about the appropriation of the discussion around decolonization. And I'm often reminding myself that one of the major triggers for the current discussions around decolonization in academia, but also in global health, was the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, but also in the UK, but especially in South Africa, which I think is an important thing to remember, that a lot of these discussions are happening in different spaces. Often those of us who are in global spaces are very obsessed with our little global space, and we only hear what each other is saying. Often also because we all speak the same language, and I use the word language metaphorically here. And often also because in those other spaces where people are discussing these kind of issues, they may not necessarily be using the word decolonization or using the same frameworks and references that we do. And I think it's important that we learn how to listen to those conversations because there's a lot going on there. And a focus on this global quote unquote conversation in itself becomes appropriation if it's not listening to and drawing on and drawing from and learning from those more local focused specific conversations that are contextual and situated.
Thank you very much, Sheye. And that is a very nice way to start wrapping up this bit of the webinar. It's been very exciting to host all the contributors. As part of the wrap-up, can I invite Nadia at Tego to do a wrap-up?
Hi, everyone. It's been a really great and rich discussion, and I would do you all a bit of a disservice if I try to summarize it, but I'll just touch on a few points that we can take away from this webinar. And I have categorized those points in four areas or 4 steps. So it's first trying to understand what we are dealing with, decolonization or decoloniality. And Caesar started that very well, so that we actually ask ourselves what is morally wrong, so that we will focus on the right things as we deal with all of this. And it's especially important to understand it in the context of global health, knowing that because of the silencing, as he so aptly put it, some health needs and potential health solutions are being silenced. And this agenda demanded by social justice and even health rights that some of these solutions or needs are articulated. And we know enough, even if not for social justice, we know enough in global health to know that if it affects one, it affects all. So it's very important to ensure that these are all highlighted. And the second thing is awareness, that this discourse does not belong to any group of people. It doesn't belong to the colonized, and it doesn't belong to the colonizer. It doesn't belong to certain groups of people. And it's also important to go beyond just preaching to the converted. So reaching out to different actors. We know that structures are required, institutional mechanisms, governments within global health system, but also in the wider political economy. And the third thing is about challenging deep-rooted ideas and structures. And that's one of the things that this webinar sought to do, chipping away at structures and processes. So not just to improve, but actually challenge based on the emerging understanding that is coming out as we discuss some of these concepts. And the last thing I'll touch on is about proactive and transformational action. And there have been a lot of this, all the speakers have come up with a lot of practical suggestions to do this in the area of research studies, in the area of educational programs, in the area of grant programs, the importance of solidarity or experiential knowledge. And I think all of it is actually important so that we can tackle the issue from all these areas and galvanize the learning as the process goes on, sharing ideas as well. And more importantly, to end all this as we make progress to tackle some of the concerns that come up, like whether the gains are going to be endangered, whether the issue is too big to tackle, that when we meet them, we tackle them to move forward. Where is there appropriation going on? We tackle all of these things. It's only when we put all of these things together that we can move forward. So we are looking forward to learning more, getting feedback, sharing ideas as we move into the HSG conference later in the year. So we'll look forward to hearing from you as we keep going. And please get involved in the exchange, the decolonization exchange, as well as the ethics and justice TWG activities and what. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadia, the contributors, the speakers, everybody who has been working very hard to make this webinar a success. As we said, we'll have an organized session in the HSG symposium. Please get to the website and you'll get a recording also uploaded there. We have two exciting opportunities also, a postdoctoral position that is closing the next 1 week. That is on decolonization. Please spread it around. If there are people who could apply as suitable, encourage them too. And we have a small grant award. Please link on the check on the link that Stas will be posting as well, and you can apply for those small grants to look at the decolonization and bring activism or attention to issues of decolonization. Thank you very much, all the contributors and everybody else for attending and for your questions. We may not have answered all the questions. As we said earlier, we will provide a summary of the notes that might be responding to some of the questions you've raised. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc.